Imagine waking up one morning and realizing the sun is no longer the sun. It is still there, somewhere above you, hidden behind the sky. But it does not warm your face. It does not throw sharp shadows across the ground. It does not rise with power, color, or life. It hangs above the world like a dying lamp. The fields are gray, the streets are gray, the faces of people around you are gray. At first, no one understands what is happening. A farmer steps outside and looks toward the horizon. His crops should be reaching toward the light, but the air feels wrong. Cold, heavy, almost lifeless. A mother opens the door of her home and sees her children staring upward in silence. A priest walks into the street and finds people already gathered, whispering, praying, pointing at the sky. A merchant on the road stops his cart because even his animals seem unsettled. Everyone sees the same thing. The sun has risen, but the world has not become bright. And the most terrifying part is that this is not an eclipse. It does not last a few minutes. It does not pass. The next day, the sky is still dim. The next week, the sun is still weak. Months go by, and the light does not return the way it should. For people living in the year 536 AD, it must have felt like the heavens had turned against humanity. They had no satellites, no weather reports, no scientists explaining the atmosphere, no global news telling them that the same strange darkness was being seen in distant lands. They only had fear, and above them a pale sun that seemed to shine without warmth. This is the story of 536 AD, the year the sun disappeared, the harvests failed, and the ancient world entered one of the darkest periods in human history. Some disasters are remembered because they destroy cities. Pompeii was buried under volcanic ash. The Black Death filled Europe with graves. Wars burned kingdoms and erased generations. But 536 was different. There was no army at the gate. No enemy king to blame. No single battlefield. No explosion that people could point to and understand. The disaster came from the sky. It was silent. It was global. And to the people who lived through it, it may have looked like the beginning of the end of the world. To understand why this year was so frightening, we have to enter the world of the 6th century. This was not a world of comfort. Most people did not live far from hunger. Their survival depended on the rhythm of the seasons. Spring had to come at the right time. Summer had to bring warmth. Rain had to fall, but not too much. Crops had to grow, ripen, and survive long enough to be harvested. A single bad harvest could bring suffering. 2 bad harvests could bring death. Food was not something that appeared on shelves. It came from fields, animals, local markets, and trade routes that could break under pressure. For the rich, hunger meant higher prices. For the poor, hunger meant watching the last bag of grain slowly disappear. The ancient world could build walls, raise armies, carve stone, and write laws. But beneath all that power, civilization still depended on something very simple: sunlight. Without sunlight, there was no harvest. Without harvests, there was no bread. Without bread, there was no order. And in 536 AD, sunlight itself began to fail. The Roman world had already been wounded before this disaster arrived. The Western Roman Empire had fallen decades earlier. Its old cities still stood, but the empire that once ruled them was gone. In the East, the Roman Empire survived under Emperor Justinian, ruling from Constantinople. Constantinople was one of the greatest cities on earth. It was rich, crowded, powerful, and ambitious. Ships came from across the Mediterranean. Gold moved through its markets. Soldiers marched under imperial banners. Churches rose above the city, their domes reaching toward heaven. Justinian wanted to restore Rome's glory. He wanted to recover lost lands, rebuild imperial power, and prove that Rome was not dead. But empires often look strongest just before history tests them. Behind the walls of cities, Ordinary people still feared the same things their ancestors feared: a failed crop, a sick child, a tax collector at the door, a winter that lasted too long, a summer that never came. Then, in 536, the sky changed. Ancient writers described a strange dimming of the sun. One of the most famous descriptions came from the historian Procopius, who wrote that the sun gave light without brightness, like the moon. That phrase is chilling because it is so simple. He was not describing a normal storm. He was not describing cloudy weather. He was describing a world where daylight itself had become unnatural. Imagine standing outside at noon and feeling as if the day never fully arrived. The sun is above you, but it gives no comfort. People keep looking upward because the sky feels wrong in a way the human mind cannot ignore. We are made to trust the sun. It is the most reliable thing in our lives. Kingdoms rise and fall. People are born and buried. Languages change. But the sun rises. So what happens when even the sun becomes uncertain? Fear changes shape. It is no longer fear of one person, one animal, one storm, or one battle. It becomes cosmic fear. The fear that the entire order of the world has broken. People in 536 did not know that tiny particles from a volcanic eruption could rise high into the atmosphere and reflect sunlight back into space. They did not know about climate systems. They did not know about sulfur aerosols. They did not know that an eruption far away could poison the light for people who never saw the volcano. They only knew what they could see. The sky was dim. The air was cold. The seasons were failing. And the gods, or God, or fate, seemed silent. In villages, the first conversations were probably confused. Maybe people told themselves it would pass. The sky will clear tomorrow. The warmth will return next week. The crops are slow, but they may recover. Humans are very good at hoping that disaster is temporary. But then the weeks stretched on. The strange light remained. The air stayed colder than it should have been. The fields did not respond. Plants that needed warmth struggled. Trees bloomed poorly. Grain grew weak. Animals became thinner. A bad feeling moved through the countryside. Farmers know fear before kings do. They see it in the soil. They see it in leaves. They see it in the silence of animals, in the color of wheat, in the weight of clouds. A ruler may not understand a famine until taxes stop coming in. A farmer understands it when the field looks wrong. And in 536, the fields looked wrong, across a huge part of the known world. The disaster did not hit like a wave. It spread like a shadow. In some places, the cold was the first sign. In others, the dim sky. In others, hunger. In others, rumors. People traveling along roads carried stories with them. The sun is weak in the next province too. The harvest failed there as well. They say snow fell in summer far to the east. They say bread is disappearing from the markets. They say this is punishment. They say it is the end. In a world without modern communication, rumor was a kind of weather. It moved from village to village, from port to port, from market to market, changing as it traveled. And when people are hungry, rumor becomes dangerous. Because hunger does not simply empty the stomach, it changes society. At first, prices rise. Then the poor begin to suffer. Then the middle begin to panic. Then people start selling what they own: tools, animals, jewelry, land, anything that can be traded for grain. Then the roads fill with people searching for food. Some leave farms that can no longer feed them. Some travel to cities, hoping for bread. Some beg outside churches. Some steal because hunger has burned away shame. Every famine has a sound. It is not always screaming. Sometimes it is quieter. The sound of a mother scraping the bottom of a storage jar. the sound of a door closing because a neighbor cannot share any more, the sound of a marketplace when no one is laughing, the sound of church bells ringing for too many funerals, the sound of children asking for food in a house where there is none. That is what the dim sun eventually meant. Not mystery, not only fear. Hunger. The ancient world was built around bread. Bread was not just food, it was survival, payment, politics, and peace. In cities, rulers understood that hungry crowds could become angry crowds. In the countryside, families understood that if the grain failed, nothing else mattered. And when the harvest failed not in one place, but across many regions, hunger became something larger than personal tragedy. It became historical force. A cold summer can change an empire. It can weaken armies because soldiers need food. It can reduce taxes because farmers cannot pay what they do not have. It can damage trade because merchants cannot sell to people who are starving. It can increase disease because hungry bodies cannot fight infection. It can create violence because desperate people make desperate choices. This is why 536 was not only a strange year in the sky, it was the beginning of a chain reaction. The sun dimmed, the climate cooled, the harvests failed, hunger spread, and the world became weaker. At the top of society, rulers may have tried to continue as if the empire could still function normally. Taxes still had to be collected, wars still had to be fought, laws still had to be enforced, roads still had to be guarded. But nature does not care about imperial plans. Justinian could dream of restoring Rome. He could send generals across the sea. He could build churches and command armies. But he could not command the sun to shine. That is one of the most brutal truths of history. Human power has limits. A king can order men into battle. An emperor can raise a monument. A priest can lead a prayer. A soldier can hold a wall. A farmer can plant the field. But no one can negotiate with a dead summer. And for the people living through this disaster, there was no clear ending in sight. That may have been the worst part. When a city is attacked, people know what danger looks like. They can see the army. They can hide, fight, flee, or surrender. When a fire spreads, people can run from the flames. When a flood rises, people can climb to higher ground. But where do you run when the sky itself has changed? The darkness was everywhere. A man could leave his village and find the same dim sun in another valley. A merchant could sail to another port and hear the same stories. A family could pray in one church, then another, that the air outside remained cold. There was no escape because the disaster was not local. It was atmospheric. It was above everyone, and that kind of danger does something deep to the human mind. It makes people feel abandoned, not attacked, abandoned, as if the world they trusted had stopped caring whether they lived. Some people must have turned to religion with desperation. Others must have searched for someone to blame. In times of unexplained disaster, fear often becomes suspicion. Maybe some blamed sinners. Maybe some blamed foreigners. Maybe some blamed rulers. Maybe some believed the final days had arrived. And who could easily convince them otherwise? If you had lived in that world, without science, without global information, and watched the sun fade for month after month, would you have stayed calm? Would you have said, "This is probably volcanic material in the upper atmosphere"? Or would you have wondered if heaven had closed its doors? This is where the story of 536 becomes more than history. It becomes psychological horror. Because the monster is not a creature. The monster is uncertainty. Every morning, people woke up and checked the sky, still grey. Every afternoon, they waited for warmth, still cold. Every evening, they counted what food remained, still less. The disaster repeated itself day after day until fear became normal. And when fear becomes normal, people change. They stop planning far ahead. They stop trusting the future. They become smaller inside their own lives. Survival replaces ambition. A family that once dreamed of buying more land now dreams of having enough grain for winter. A young man who once imagined travel now stays home to protect what little remains. A ruler who once planned conquest now worries about empty treasuries and restless cities. A civilization under stress begins to narrow. It thinks less about glory and more about endurance. But 536 was only the opening wound. The years that followed brought more suffering. The climate shock did not vanish quickly. Evidence suggests that the mid-6th century entered a period of severe cooling, sometimes called the Late Antique Little Ice Age. More volcanic events around this time may have deepened the crisis. To ordinary people, that meant the nightmare kept returning. One bad year is terrible. Several bad years can break the confidence of an entire generation. Children who were young in 536 may have grown up remembering a world where the sun failed, bread vanished, and adults spoke in frightened voices. Imagine being born into that decade. Your earliest memories are not of abundance, but of shortage. Not of golden summers, but of cold fields. Not of safety, but of whispers. You would learn early that the world is not stable, that the things adults promise can disappear, that hunger can enter any house, that even the sky cannot be trusted. And then, just when the world had already been weakened, the plague came. In 541 AD, only a few years after the darkened sun, a deadly disease began spreading through the Eastern Roman Empire. It entered through Egypt and moved along trade routes across the Mediterranean. Ships carried more than grain and goods. They carried rats, fleas, and death. By 542, the plague reached Constantinople. The great imperial city became a place of terror. Imagine the streets of Constantinople before the plague. Crowded markets, ships at the harbour, gold changing hands, children running through narrow lanes, soldiers in armour, priests moving through churches, merchants shouting prices, bakers pulling bread from ovens, officials carrying messages, the city alive with ambition. Now imagine sickness moving through it. At first, perhaps, it is only a rumour, a fever near the docks, a family dead in one district, a strange swelling, a sudden collapse. Then the deaths multiply. People avoid each other in the streets. Doors remain shut. Houses become prisons. The sick cry out from inside. The healthy walk faster, covering their faces, trying not to breathe too close to anyone. Bodies appear faster than they can be buried. Fear spreads almost as quickly as the disease. No one knows who will be next. A man wakes up healthy and is dead within days. A mother cares for her child, then develops the same symptoms. A priest goes to comfort the dying, then becomes one of them. A city that once felt eternal begins to feel like a tomb. And remember, this plague did not strike a strong world. It struck a world already damaged by years of climate stress, hunger, and fear. That is why the story of 536 is so powerful. It was not one isolated disaster. It was the first falling stone in an avalanche. Darkness, cold, famine, economic pressure, disease, political weakness. Each crisis made the next one worse. A hungry population is more vulnerable to illness. A sick population cannot work fields. Empty fields create more hunger. Hunger creates movement. Movement spreads disease. Disease weakens armies. Weak armies cannot protect borders. Weak borders invite enemies. One change in the sky can echo through history for decades. This is what people often misunderstand about ancient disasters. They imagine one dramatic moment. A volcano erupts, a city burns, a battle is lost. But the real damage often comes later, after the ash has fallen, after the first fear has passed, after people think the worst is over. History is shaped by aftershocks. The aftershock of 536 was not only environmental, it was political. The Eastern Roman Empire under Justinian had been trying to reclaim the old Roman world. His armies fought in North Africa, Italy, and beyond. For a moment, it seemed possible that Rome's lost greatness might be restored. But restoration requires resources. It requires food, money, healthy soldiers, stable cities, trust in the future. The disasters of the 6th century attacked all of those things. They did not instantly destroy the empire. History is rarely that simple. But they weakened it. They made every ambition more expensive, every war more difficult, every recovery slower. And beyond Rome, other societies were also affected. Climate does not respect borders. A colder world pressures everyone. Nomadic groups may move because grazing lands change. Farmers may abandon land. Trade routes may shift. Local conflicts may intensify. Disease may travel farther as people move in search of safety. The world after 536 was not the same as the world before it. The sun returned, but confidence did not return so easily. That is another truth hidden inside this story. A disaster can end physically long before it ends psychologically. The sky can clear, but people remember. The harvest can improve, but families still store fear inside their homes. A child who saw hunger does not forget the sound of an empty table. A city that buried thousands does not immediately become alive again just because the streets are open. A civilization that discovers its weakness does not easily recover its old pride. The people who survived 536 and the years after it carried something with them. A memory of the world going dim. And perhaps that memory shaped the way they understood everything that came later. Bad weather was no longer just bad weather. A failed harvest was no longer just a failed harvest. A strange sky was no longer just a strange sky. It was a warning, because they had seen what could happen. The terrifying thing about 536 is that it reveals how fragile human civilization has always been. We like to tell history as if it is driven only by kings, battles, inventions, and ideas. We talk about emperors, generals, religions, empires, trade, laws, revolutions. But beneath all of that, history is also driven by temperature, rainfall, sunlight, bacteria, and grain. A small changing climate can decide whether an army marches or starves. A failed harvest can do more damage than a lost battle. A disease carried by ships can weaken an empire more effectively than an invading army. The world of 536 teaches us that human beings live inside nature, not above it. The Romans could build roads across continents, but they could not build a road out of climate. They could construct walls, but not walls against the atmosphere. They could record laws, but no law could order summer to return. And the same is true for every civilization that has ever existed. Ancient Egypt depended on the Nile. Mesopotamia depended on rivers and irrigation. Rome depended on grain. Medieval kingdoms depended on harvests. Modern nations depend on supply chains, energy systems, stable weather, and global trade. We are more advanced than the people of 536, but we are not separate from the same basic truth. Civilization is a thin layer. Underneath it is hunger, disease, weather, and fear. That is why this story still feels disturbing today, because it is not only about the past. It reminds us that the world can change in ways people do not expect. For the people of 536, the disaster probably seemed impossible until it was already happening. No farmer woke up expecting the sun to weaken for months. No merchant expected trade to suffer because the sky changed. No emperor expected his plans to be challenged by particles in the air. No child expected summer to feel like winter. The impossible became normal. That is one of history's cruelest patterns. Before disaster, people say it cannot happen. During disaster, they ask how it happened. After disaster, they say they should have seen it coming. But the people in 536 could not see it coming. They were not foolish. They were human. They lived in the world they understood, until the world became something else. Picture a small village somewhere in Europe during that year. There is no grand palace, no famous battle, no historian standing nearby to record every name. Just ordinary people. A father walks into a field and bends down to touch the soil. He knows the plants are weak. He knows the family will not have enough. But he does not say it yet. His wife already knows. She can hear it in the way he comes back inside. Their children notice the silence, but do not understand it. At dinner, the portions are smaller. No one complains. Outside, the sky remains pale. A few days later, a neighbor comes asking to borrow grain. The answer is no. Not because they are cruel, but because they are afraid. Weeks later, someone leaves the village, then another, then a family. The church is fuller than before. The market is quieter. People speak less about next year. They speak more about surviving winter. This is how great disasters are actually lived. Not as dates in a textbook, but as small losses repeated until life becomes unrecognizable. A little less food, a little less warmth, a little less trust, a little less hope. And still, the sun rises without brightness. Now imagine another scene, far away in Constantinople. A government official walks through the city trying to maintain order. The empire still needs taxes, soldiers still need payment, grain still needs distribution. But the mood has changed. People are thinner, angrier, more religious, more suspicious. Some believe the end is near. Some blame the government. Some blame sin. Some simply try to find bread. The official may believe in the empire. He may believe in law, power, and Rome's destiny. But even he can feel that something is slipping. Then, a few years later, plague enters the city. Whatever confidence remained begins to collapse. This is why the year 536 can be described as one of the most terrifying moments in human history. Not because it killed the most people in a single day, not because it had the largest battle, not because it left behind the most ruins, but because it attacked the foundations of life itself. Light, warmth, food, health, trust. When those things fail together, civilization becomes very quiet. There is also a mystery at the center of this story that makes it unforgettable. Where exactly did the eruption happen? For years, researchers have debated possible sources. Some evidence points toward a massive eruption in the northern hemisphere, possibly Iceland or another volcanic region. Other eruptions around the same period may have added to the cooling. The exact chain of events is still studied, but the outcome is clear. Something powerful entered the atmosphere. The sunlight weakened, the climate shifted, human beings suffered. That uncertainty adds another layer to the horror. A disaster changed the course of lives across continents, and most of the people who suffered never knew where it began. Somewhere, a volcano may have exploded with unimaginable force. Ash and sulfur rose into the sky. Winds carried particles across the world, and months later, a farmer, thousands of miles away, watched his crops die without ever knowing why. That is almost impossible to process. One violent event in one part of the earth can become famine in another. A mountain can erupt, and a child far away can starve. That is the hidden connectedness of history. The ancient world was not globalized the way ours is, but it was still connected by air, climate, trade, disease, and movement. People did not need to know they were connected in order to be affected. The atmosphere connected them. The seas connected them. The grain routes connected them. The plague connected them. And suffering moved through those connections. This is why 536 is not just an ancient curiosity. It is a warning from the past. It shows us that history is not always shaped by intentions. No one planned 536, no king ordered it, no army caused it, no enemy designed it. It happened because Earth is powerful, unstable, and indifferent. Human beings build meaning. Nature does not always offer it. For the people who survived, the meaning had to come later. Maybe some saw the disaster as punishment. Maybe some saw it as a test. Maybe some simply saw it as hunger. But from our distance, we can see something else. We can see how a natural event became a human catastrophe because societies were vulnerable. They depended on fragile harvests. They lacked medical knowledge. They had limited storage. They had no way to predict or explain the climate shock. Their world was strong in some ways and helpless in others. And that is often true of civilizations. They are never simply strong or weak. They are strong against some dangers and almost defenseless against others. Rome could defeat armies, but it could not defeat a darkened sky. Constantinople could build walls, but walls could not stop plague. Farmers could work hard, but hard work could not replace sunlight. That is the tragedy of 536. People may have done everything right and still suffered. A farmer could plant at the right time. A mother could ration food carefully. A ruler could organize grain shipments. A priest could comfort the terrified. And still the cold remained. Still the crops failed. Still disease came. There are moments in history when human effort meets something larger than itself. 536 was one of those moments, and yet humanity survived. That may be the most important part of the story. The year was terrible. The decade was brutal. The suffering was real. But people endured. They buried the dead. They replanted fields. They rebuilt trade. They adapted. They carried on even when they did not understand what had happened. The sun returned, not as suddenly as people may have prayed for, but slowly, over time, the sky cleared. Harvests improved. Children were born after the darkness. Cities continued to breathe. History moved forward. The world did not end, but it changed. The people who lived through that age experienced something that must have felt impossible, a world where daylight could fail. And once humanity has seen that, it can never completely forget it. Today, 536 AD is not as famous as the Black Death, Pompeii, or the fall of Rome. It does not have one iconic image that everyone knows. There is no single ruined city frozen in ash, no famous painting of the moment, no battlefield where tourists can stand and imagine the clash. Its horror was spread out, in cold fields, in empty storage rooms, in hungry villages, in pale skies, in cities waiting for bread, in plague pits that came later. That may be why it was forgotten by many. Slow disasters are harder to remember than sudden ones. A city buried in one day becomes legend. A famine that grows over months becomes statistics. A plague that follows years of hunger becomes part of a larger blur. But for the people who lived it, nothing about it was abstract. Every day had a weight. Every meal mattered. Every change in the sky was watched. Every rumor carried fear. And every sunrise asked the same question: will the world come back today? For month after month, the answer was no. That is why this story deserves to be remembered, because it captures one of the deepest human fears. Not death in battle, not a monster in the dark, not a king's cruelty, but the fear that reality itself can become unfamiliar. The fear that the rules you trusted can break. The fear that morning can arrive without light. In modern times, we sometimes imagine ancient people as distant from us, almost like characters from another world. They wore different clothes. They spoke different languages. They believed different things. But when the sky darkened in 536, their fear was human in a way we can still understand. They worried about their children. They watched food disappear. They searched for explanations. They argued, prayed, blamed, hoped, and waited. They wanted the same thing people have always wanted: a safe home, enough food, a future that makes sense. And for a time, 536 took that away. If you had lived then, you might not have known the name of the emperor. You might not have cared about imperial politics. You might never have seen Constantinople. Your world may have been a small house, a field, a church, a road, a market, and the people you loved. But the disaster would still have found you. Not because you were important, but because no one was outside its reach. That is the terror of the year the sun disappeared. It made everyone small. Kings, farmers, soldiers, priests, merchants, children. All of them lived under the same weakened sky. And for once, the greatest power on earth was not an empire. It was the atmosphere. So when we ask, what was the most terrifying day in human history? Maybe the answer is not a single day. Maybe it is the first morning in 536, when people stepped outside and saw that the sun had changed. Because in that moment, the world they knew began to disappear. They did not yet know about the famine. They did not yet know about the years of cold. They did not yet know about the plague that would come after. They did not yet know that historians, centuries later, would look back and call their time one of the worst periods to be alive. They only knew what their eyes told them. The light was wrong. The air was cold. The sky was silent. And something had happened that no one could explain. That is the kind of fear that reaches across time. A fear old enough to belong to the ancient world, but familiar enough to disturb us now. Because every civilization, no matter how powerful, depends on things it cannot fully control. The sun must rise, the seasons must turn, the fields must grow, the sick must be cared for, the dead must be buried. The living must believe tomorrow is worth reaching. In 536, that belief was tested. The sun rose, but it did not shine. Summer came, but it did not warm. The fields stood, but they did not feed. And humanity looked upward, waiting for the world to become itself again. For many, it never did. For others, survival was the only victory. And for history, 536 remains a dark reminder that sometimes the most terrifying events are not the loudest. They are quiet. They come without warning. They cover the sky. They empty the fields.
They weaken the body. They enter the city. They turn ordinary life into waiting. Waiting for food, waiting for warmth, waiting for answers, waiting for the sun.
And that is why the year 536 AD may be remembered as one of the darkest chapters in human history. Not because the sun vanished completely, but because it stayed just visible enough to remind people what they were losing. A pale circle above a starving world, a weak light over frightened cities, a silent warning written across the sky. The day the sun disappeared was not the end of humanity, but for those who lived through it, it may have felt like the end had already begun.